The reign of the last Khan of Khans began with a war between two princes, brothers. The youngest was called Arig Bok. After the death of Munka Khan, he claimed the throne in the name of those Mongols who still lived on the steppe and who still followed the traditional way of life. His brother, Kublai, was more sophisticated. He had adopted a great many customs from Chinese civilization and wished to lead the empire down a different path. The civil war that developed in 1260 was the first time Mongol had fought Mongol since the tribal wars of Genghis Khan, and it threatened to shatter the entire empire. But the two brothers were not evenly matched. Although Arig Bok had the support of all the great Mongol families, he didn't have his brother's strategic genius. Long before any real harm could be done, Arig Bok's armies were defeated, and Kublai emerged victorious. There is nothing in the formal court portrait of Kublai, as an older man, that indicates just how different he was from the other Mongol Khans. But for a start, he grew up here, on land he inherited in northern China. Although he learned to ride and hunt like any other Mongol prince, he was also taught how to read and write. He had grown up in a land of farmers and learnt from Chinese teachers to respect and care for the well-being of the people who worked the land. By the time he was 30, he ruled a vast and extremely prosperous principality. Kublai's attachment to his Chinese subjects earned him many enemies back in Mongolia, but nothing infuriated them more than his decision to build a city on Chinese territory. This is almost all that is left of that city, Shangtu. It was built on the frontier between the steppe and the cultivated fields of northern China. Behind its walls, Kublai built a hunting reserve and had it stocked with animals for his sport. Rivers and lakes were dug, and grass was planted from the Mongol steppe. We in the West know this place as Xanadu.
In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf the sacred river ran, through caverns measureless to man, down to the sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. And here were forests, ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery.
These are the foundations of the Pavilion of Great Harmony, which once stood at the heart of the palace city. The roof tiles were once bright green, the grounds decorated with altars and carved statues. Surrounding it were a number of smaller palaces and government buildings. Inside, the pavilions had gold leaf ceilings and walls lined with painted silk. The man who built this stately pleasure dome was not only extremely wealthy, he was also extremely cultured and had great vision. It was the home of the man who was about to inherit the mantle of Genghis Khan. By 1264, with his enemies cowed into submission, Kublai was accepted as the next great Khan. And so began the reign of Kublai. It was to be an illustrious one. But the unity of the empire had been strained by the civil war. It would take a man of immense resources to bind it together. The empire that Kublai inherited had already been divided into separate khanates, ruled by various descendants of Genghis. In the far west was the Golden Horde, conquered under Ogadai Khan. To the south was the Ilkhanate, ruled by the conquerors of Persia. In the center was the Chagatai Khanate, and the rest of the empire, the Mongol homeland and China, was the personal domain of the great Khan. At that time, it was the largest empire in history, yet there was still room for expansion. To the southeast lay the unconquered lands of the Sung, still the real heart of China, and a challenge to Kublai. Kublai's campaign against the Sung began with the conquest of the tiny kingdom of Dali, which lay on the borders of Tibet and guarded the western approaches to Sung China. The conquering of this remote kingdom itself was swift and bloodless, so much so that Kublai was moved to grant the people of Dali rare privileges in return for their submission. Before he moved on, he erected a pillar engraved with his instructions. There was to be no plundering of this little kingdom. It then went on to describe in detail Kublai's prowess as a general. Though led by Mongol officers, the bulk of Kublai's forces were made up of Chinese infantry. Southern China was either densely forested or covered in paddy fields, not good terrain for cavalry. So when Kublai's army set forth for Sung China, they did so on foot. These new armies had different needs. No longer could they hunt for their rations. Supply lines would have to be established. New strategies would also have to be developed. There would be no lightning raids, no set-piece cavalry battles. This war of Chinese against Chinese would take years to unfold. The Sung had a great many fortified cities, and when Kublai's forces tried to take Xiangyang, they were held at bay for 5 years. The Sung were ferocious defenders. They had a considerable culture to defend. They also had a great navy and would never be really conquered until they were defeated at sea. So again, the Mongols had to adapt to a new form of warfare. With Korean and Chinese ships, they pursued the Sung navy until it was finally destroyed in 1276. When the last male heir to the Sung dynasty was drowned, resistance collapsed. When the Mongol forces finally entered the Sung capital of Hangzhou at the mouth of the Yangtze River, they were confronted with the largest city on earth. More than 1.5 million people lived in this great seaport, and its wealth and importance to the empire was unimaginable. From here, a massive civil service governed a nation of nearly 40 million people. Built around a network of canals and waterways, it was the pearl of southern China. Along its causeways, the victorious Mongols rode into what was then the most important city in all the Orient. Its palaces, granaries, treasure houses and temples were catalogued by the Mongol commanders and a census conducted of all the inhabitants. In contrast to the aftermath of previous Mongol victories, no destruction of the city's buildings and treasures took place, and the Sung royal family were allowed to live in relative comfort for the rest of their lives. The entire campaign and the way victory was achieved was all part of a much larger strategy, not only to conquer, but to win both the hearts and minds of the Chinese. Kublai's senior wife, Chabi, encouraged this policy and urged her husband to proclaim himself emperor and founder of a new Chinese dynasty. It was extremely shrewd. By drawing on the principles of government laid down by Confucius, Kublai set about presenting himself to the entire Chinese nation as the very embodiment of Chinese thinking. His enthronement was conducted strictly according to traditional Confucian custom. This, in modern terms, was very good public relations. It meant the revival of dozens of traditional ceremonies that had not been performed at court for many years. In choosing the name Yuan for his dynasty, Kublai also turned to Confucian principles. The word Yuan has powerful connotations, for in the Confucian book, the I Ching, it means the origins of the universe. Kublai had united all of China, from the foothills of Burma to Manchuria, under a single dynasty, a single lord. By proclaiming the Yuan dynasty, Kublai gave every impression of having forsaken Mongol life, but it was not so. Behind a screen of Confucian ceremonies, Kublai established an order of racial precedence. The most important positions were held by Mongols, and the most lowly by the southern Chinese. Kublai constructed a centralized Mongol authority of 3 divisions. First, a secretariat, responsible for all civil matters. Second, a privy council, responsible for all military matters. And third, a censorate, a vast army of spies that traveled the country for the purpose of preventing rebellions. So, while these large outdoor rituals continued, the Chinese were encouraged to believe that life was as it had always been, in harmony with nature. But Kublai's motives were not entirely cynical. He did care about the well-being of the people who made up the most important part of the empire. The new emperor introduced tax exemptions for those trying to rebuild their homes. He built granaries, irrigation systems, and reclaimed land. He even passed a law preventing Mongols from grazing their horses on farming land. Surprising indeed from a grandson of Genghis Khan. But if the economy was to emerge from the gloom of war, it needed more than just prosperous agriculture. By nationalizing all the gold and silver mines throughout China, like this one, which dates from his time, Kublai set out to establish a government-controlled economy based around a large central exchequer. The mining or hoarding of all precious metals was forbidden. They were to be a state monopoly. From across the country, precious ore and even silver coins were transported under guard to the new state-operated mints. Here, the ore was melted down and turned into imperial ingots. Soon, a vast reserve of silver was produced in a variety of weights, each stamped with the official imperial mark. Kublai had effectively created a silver standard. Against these reserves, Kublai printed paper notes, which were distributed throughout the land in return for coins or silver. So, in a nation of over 50 million people, there was one official currency, and it was Kublai's. His was probably the first administration in the world to have what amounted to a central bank and a semi-planned economy. Kublai also knew that the key to a strong economy, then as now, was through production and trade. Chinese ceramics were greatly valued abroad, so he encouraged the establishment of potteries all across the south, near the great seaports. Kublai, the grandson of a nomadic horseman, issued licenses to every factory. He did everything he could to encourage production. Soon the countryside was shrouded in smoke from the hundreds of kilns that worked day and night to keep up supply. While artisans produced pottery, silks, silverware, carpets, furniture, and armaments, Kublai built a massive merchant fleet to carry them right around the Orient. He was great Khan of half the world, and he would take every advantage of it. His fleets, captained by skilled navigators, traded right across Southeast Asia, to India, and even as far west as the Persian Gulf. Here in particular, in the cities of the Ilkhanate, Chinese pottery was always in demand. But it was the trade of ideas and technology that made this sea link so important. Here, in the Gulf, Chinese merchants made a valuable discovery. The Persian artisans had developed a number of important new ceramic dyes. The most famous was cobalt. After it had been ground into a thin paste, the Persians used it to coat mud bricks before they were fired. In the kiln, this dull grey finish was transformed into a radiant blue, and the local builders were using these thick tiles to clad the outside of their domed buildings. In China, the cobalt, imported from the Persian Gulf, was used to produce the most delicate patterns. Under Kublai, Chinese potters were given free rein. They could illustrate any subject, as long as it was about hunting and horses. It was during this period that the first blue-white glazes were produced, the very best of Chinese pottery. It was a two-way trade. Chinese techniques soon influenced Persian artists. Buildings were decorated in ever more complex ceramics, and their designs reflected the Oriental influence. Though he never knew it, Kublai could take much of the credit. Kublai understood that trade across the breadth of Asia could be the means of binding the empire together. He poured fortunes into any number of projects to encourage trade. He expanded the great harbor here at Hangzhou, and each year thousands of ships were guided through the straits by a lighthouse near the mouth of the inner harbor. The old Sung capital became the most important trading center in the world. Against the wishes of his Chinese advisors, Kublai encouraged foreigners to come to his new China. Persian merchants from the Ilkhanate arrived, built trading houses, villas, and of course, mosques. Islam spread along the coastal cities, side by side with Hinduism, which arrived with merchants and craftsmen from the subcontinent. Arabs from the Gulf, Turks from Asia Minor, Russians from the Golden Horde. For the first time in her history, China was inundated with foreign cultures. The Mongol policy of religious tolerance under Kublai saw the spread of alien religions. And when the Pope agreed to establish an archbishopric in China, Kublai hailed it as evidence that his empire really was universal, and China was at the center of it. But it was Kublai's links with the great Italian city-states, and in particular Venice, that demonstrated his true internationalism. The Venetians had traded in Oriental cargoes for years, but only through Persian middlemen. But now there were encouraging reports that there was a safe overland route leading directly to Cathay. And Venetian merchants hoped to get there first. In 1271, Niccolo, Maffeo and Marco Polo set off from a house which once stood here. Their destination, the land of the great Khan. When they departed, the Venetians thought they might be away for 2 or 3 years. They were away for 17, and Marco Polo's book, written and illustrated on his eventual return, was closely studied by traders and medieval geographers. He described in detail his journey across Asia to Kublai's fabled city of Chengdu. There they were granted an audience with the great Khan and delivered letters of greeting from the Pope. The Polos were followed by other European merchants. To aid their journeys, Kublai built along the route 1,000 new post stations, or caravanserais. Each was provided with a hostelry, a granary, stables, and fresh pack animals. It was the start of a remarkable era in the history of trade. All along the great Khan's highways, hundreds of merchants traveled back and forth. For the first time, East traded with West, face to face. But the 1,000 caravanserais which Kublai built were as nothing compared to the great engineering projects he was initiating in China, like the Great Canal. It employed more than 3 million laborers and took more than 10 years to complete. The Great Canal was built to alleviate the persistent famines in northern China, where there was not enough arable land to support the population. But a canal that linked Hangzhou in the south with the great cities of the north would ensure imported supplies. For that, or any age, it was a remarkable feat of engineering. The canal was more than 150 miles long and had hundreds of locks, some of which are still there today. The canal was also cut deep enough to take ocean-going junks. Consequently, ships that had sailed the islands of Southeast Asia could navigate their way more than 100 miles inland. The canal reached towards a large inland port. It was all part of Kublai's great enterprise. At the end of the canal was a new city, bigger and more magnificent than the legendary Chengdu. This was the new capital of the new united China. Here, ships could deliver their cargo right to the Khan's door. "700 years later, there are still some echoes from Kublai's day. During the 1960s, archaeologists dug down to find large sections of the old streets and foundations. For a brief period, it was possible to get a glimpse of the remains of pavilions, temples, and statues. The scholars worked quickly to catalogue their discoveries before it was all covered up and built over. The only other physical legacy of the old capital were the great walls that once embraced it. Like a great many relics from the past, they were pulled down during the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. The last of the great city gates were bulldozed to make way for a freeway. But with the aid of the archaeologists' records and modern computer animation, it's possible to recreate Kublai's greatest success. This was Dadu, the great middle capital, Kublai's ultimate gift to his subjects. It was the perfect Chinese city, built upon Confucian ideals. It was built within a perfect rectangle. The boundary walls ran for 24 miles. Each faced either exactly north, south, east, or west. Inside were two smaller compounds which contained the inner city and the imperial city. The inland harbour swept right up to the trading district. There, rows of warehouses were constructed along a grid of boulevards which designated separate districts for artisans, merchants and foreigners. Parks and gardens dotted the landscape. But the heart of Dadu was the great imperial city. High officials and envoys entered the inner sanctum from the south, the traditional Chinese approach, through one of 12 city gates. From there, they traveled nearly 2 kilometers down the Imperial Way towards Kublai's palace. This road passed through the middle compound, which housed government departments and the homes of civil servants. Just beyond the Huzai Gate, they crossed a series of bridges and continued to the gate of the palace city. In the gate itself were housed more senior ministries, government records, and imperial galleries. Passing through here, the visitors entered the private world of the great Khan. The inner palace city consisted of 3 main halls or pavilions where Kublai gave audiences, conducted court ceremonies, and more private affairs. But for Kublai and his immediate family, these pavilions were never really home. A large area was reserved to the east and planted with grass from the Mongolian steppes, and here they pitched their traditional gurs. This was Kublai's real home, and where visiting Mongol princes preferred to stay, under felt roofs. Here traditional shaman ceremonies took place under the disapproving gaze of the Confucians. In the midst of his ideal city, this was Kublai's affirmation of his nomadic heritage. But the real image of Dadu was an awe-inspiring walled city, which projected immense wealth and imperial power. The source of all imperial power was the area of the 3 main pavilions, the Yud Hall, Gongchen Hall, and the greatest of them all, Daming Dian. This was built on a raised structure that placed it at the top of a girdle of carved marble stairs and balustrades decorated with dragons and phoenixes. The inside was even more elaborate. According to records, there were golden dragons, red mullion windows, gold leaf everywhere. At the rear, at the end of a long corridor, was a private throne room where the most important guests were received. From these balconies, Kublai would greet his subjects during annual festivals and watch as they kowtowed before the most powerful man on earth. But building Dadu was only the beginning. It had to be populated, and not just by merchants and traders. For Dadu to succeed, it had to attract families from the traditional ruling class. Kublai's solution was to turn Dardu into a city of culture, and he would be the greatest patron. Throughout the capital, he built public theaters and he sponsored companies to perform in them. Kublai himself greatly enjoyed the theater, and his regular presence elevated its importance within society. Hundreds of companies toured the country with a growing repertoire of new works. Drama became more colloquial. It dealt with stories about ordinary people. This was an era of tremendous literary development. One of Kublai's other great passions was painting. He commissioned hundreds of new works. This is Kublai himself at the hunt. His reputation would have shone without a blemish, but he could not ignore his Mongol heritage. He yearned for yet further conquests. This would have been the view from the shores of Hakata Bay in Japan on a summer morning in 1281. Before the Japanese defenders, there appeared a massive armada containing nearly 150,000 men. They had been sent by Kublai to conquer Japan. This was the second such expedition. 6 years before, another invasion fleet had been scattered by a great storm. But this time, with more men and ships, success should have been assured. But the Japanese defenses were much stronger than expected, and the invading army, most of whom were Chinese, had little enthusiasm for the campaign. The invaders struggled bitterly for months to breach the defenses. Then, just when it seemed Kublai's forces would prevail, another great storm blew up. For the second time, the gods of nature thwarted Kublai's hopes. The Mongol fleet prepared to evacuate, but as the soldiers tried to clamber on board, they were cut to pieces. Those that did manage to escape were drowned, for almost the entire fleet was sunk. It was the most humiliating defeat in Mongol history. Nearly 80,000 men went to the bottom. The occasional remnants of Kublai's ambition are still washed up on the beaches. To the Japanese, Kublai's disaster was of enormous significance. The typhoon was no accident. It was a divine wind, kamikaze, sent by the gods to save Japan. This garden, near Hakata Bay, is filled with shrines dedicated to the defenders and to the gods who acted on Japan's behalf. Here is enshrined the belief that the gods would never allow Japan's enemies to conquer and occupy her territory. It helped to forge the Japanese belief in themselves as being different to all other peoples, special, protected by the gods. The disaster at Hakata Bay was only one of a number of humiliating defeats that brought little comfort to Kublai during his last years. The end of his life was spent in an alcoholic haze, shrouded in disappointment and shame. When he died in 1294, the empire had seen the last of the truly great descendants of Genghis Khan. In the foothills of the Chinese northern highlands, where the Mongol army first broke through into China, there is a small stone archway. It was set up by Kublai's successors as a lasting tribute to Mongol control of China. On its walls, alongside Buddhist figures, are accounts in 3 languages of the Mongol conquest and the lives of Yuan emperors. But the real and lasting legacy of the Mongol domination of China is here, the Forbidden City in modern Beijing. It was built by successive dynasties on the ruins of Kublai's great capital. Its importance to China owes much to the builders of Dadu, not least because it has remained the capital of a united China ever since Kublai decreed it so 700 years ago. Within the space of just 3 generations, the Mongols had gone from barbaric destroyers to builders of cities. And the Mongols left another legacy, though this is one that they didn't build: the Great Wall. Built by the successors to the Yuan, the Ming dynasty, it was a formidable declaration by the Chinese that they would never again allow their country to be occupied and ruled by foreigners. The Great Wall marked the end of China's trade and intellectual links with the outside world. It marked a return to a traditional, inward-looking way of life. But during that brief period when the Mongols ruled Asia and people and knowledge could move between East and West, the world changed beyond recognition. For example, the Chinese had for centuries printed their most valuable texts from wooden blocks. Thus, papers and books could be printed in unlimited copies. Movable type followed soon afterwards. By the 15th century, printers in the West were doing the same. Gunpowder also had its genesis in the East. The Mongols first encountered it during their sieges of Chinese cities. 10 years later, Hungarian chroniclers recorded its use by the invading Mongol army of 1241. There were also more prosaic ideas from the East. Noodles. Venetian merchants imported the delicacy to Italy: spaghetti. There was another import from the Mongol Empire that had its effect on Europe. In 1346, the Black Death was first recorded among Mongols laying siege to the town of Kaffa on the Black Sea. Within 30 years, this unknown Asian disease had spread as far as France and Britain. It killed 1 in 3 of all the peoples of Europe. By then, the Mongol Empire itself had already begun to disintegrate. First to go was the Ilkhanate in Persia, followed 30 years later by China. The last Khanate to hold out was the Golden Horde, which survived in fragments for almost 300 years. Today, the Mongol homeland has shrunk to a remote enclave. It is back where it all began. The hard realities of the modern political world have left it isolated between the 2 empires of Russia and China. Today, Mongols are struggling to find a role for themselves in the modern world, a world dominated by the city. Over recent years, tens of thousands of them have abandoned the land and sought the alleged attractions of urban life. Above them are the tower blocks that came with the promises of Soviet communism. Under the dictatorship of communism, Mongolia was crudely industrialized, and the ramshackle legacy of that recent era is seen almost everywhere around its capital and only city, Ulaanbaatar. Now that the Russians have gone, the Mongols have discovered that their country is virtually bankrupt, and the Russian-built factories and power stations are collapsing around them. There are no engineers to operate them, no resources to pay for spare parts. In the winter, the cities freeze, and the power stations belch wasted heat into the sky. For the last 80 or 90 years, the Mongols have been the tools of other people's empires. They have been swept along towards other people's goals. Now, at the end of the century, as they close yet another chapter, communism, in their long history, they are asking themselves, what next? Where from here? the people who have stayed on the land, little has changed and little will change. Their lives are bound up in the cycles of the seasons and the needs of their herds. Most Mongolians no longer live this close to the old nomadic life. For the majority, new rituals and new customs have had to be invented. To the traditional Nardam festival, a kind of Mongol tournament of archery, wrestling and horse racing, ancient nomadic skills, present-day Mongols have grafted the celebration of their once glorious history. The whole festival has become an instrument of a revived nationalism, a distraction from the realities of the here and now. Ancient heroes are brought to life, battles are refought, cities reconquered, and the sayings of long-dead Khans turned into song. These evocations of the past have permeated almost all aspects of life today, from politics to pop music. Even members of the Mongolian regular army are paraded before the crowds in the costume of their ancestors. Mongolia, with a shattered present and an uncertain future, is forever looking over its shoulder at what used to be. The nation's ancient history is the one thing that remains certain. Nevertheless, behind all the pageantry and costumed heroics, Mongolians carry in their hearts a deep devotion to the spirit of one man. A nomad who united the steppe tribes, forged a single nation, and set it on the path to world conquest. Ordinary Mongolians still offer up prayers to the spirit of Genghis Khan. They remember a time when they ruled over the greatest land empire the world has ever seen.